what he's talking about in class and can answer virtually any question you have with ease. But my personal favorite quote was, "He looks like Chandler and Friends." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor McFall.
Thank you, Mary. Before I get going, I wanted to quickly thank Joy from ZSR Library for giving me the opportunity to talk today, and Stephen Edwards. Is he here today? Stephen, you and I have been talking about this for well over a year, so it's happening. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to start with my bona fides on the topic. That way, if you wanted to leave, you could just leave. You think, okay, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But Mary did a good job with that. I have published 2 academic articles in the book that Mary referenced on this topic. I'll talk about all 3 of those today, as I think each of them pertains to what I want to discuss today. And kind of why do I like this topic? Why am I into this topic? First off, I work at a university, and this university, like many others, devotes a lot of resources towards its athletic programs. And it's, I think, a natural question for an economist to say, is this a proper use of the resources that the university has? And so this is one of the things that I think about when I write about this topic is, are we over-investing? Have we not done enough? What is the system that we're working in? Is the system working properly? Are there adjustments that we could make to it so that it works better? So, you know, as someone who works in a university and my career is involved with this topic, I think it's a natural thing for me to look at. I also grew up in 1980s Indiana, which was one of the gravitational centers of college basketball. And I think of college basketball and really college sports as more than just activities that students do, and it in many ways is a cultural touchstone for geographic regions. And certainly my family was very much into Indiana University sports, especially basketball. And it was a way for us to communicate across generations about this particular activity. And I think a lot of families experience college sports in the same way. And then finally, and I wanted to dispel any notion before. I don't want anyone to leave here today and think, this McFall guy doesn't like college sports, right? That he's going to dump on college sports. And that's just not the case. I participated in college sports. I was a swimmer for a couple of years at Miami University in the mid-90s. But more importantly, my experience with the young athletes who I've taught at Wake Forest have been magnificent. And I've taught starting quarterbacks and LPGA golfers and All-American soccer players and, you know, kids who are just trying to get a scholarship. And just universally, it's been a really, really good experience. So I don't want anyone to leave here today and say to themselves, you know, that McFall guy doesn't like college sports, because that's not the case. Really what I'm going to do today is talk about how I think we can make some adjustments to the system so that it's better, not only at the local level, like at the Wake Forest or ACC level, but also at the national level as well. So really simply, this is a story about how a league governs itself. And the NCAA, relative to professional leagues, is similar and different than those leagues. Every league has to make multi-dimensional choices about how it wants to govern itself. How much our athletes are going to get paid? How does it organize the season? You know, a host of other variables have to be considered when a league starts to organize itself. Over the last 40 years, though, professional leagues have had to make a bilateral decision because they have to recognize player unions. That was a hard-fought right that players finally received around 1975. The NCAA does not have to recognize any players' opinions on these matters. This is a unilateral decision, and I think that's a really important distinction as we move away from, as we compare the NCAA to professional leagues. And secondly, the choice that the NCAA is making on how it governs itself is in the extreme. And to an economist, that's important because that's where we start to see really big trade-offs. And I want to talk about some of those trade-offs today. But mainly, my research, I think, is a warning shot to the NCAA that history is not on their side here. And one of the things I want you to take away from this is I believe that NCAA basketball especially is in some trouble in trying to maintain its hold on largely having the best players who are college age play for the teams that are under its umbrella. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I think that's kind of the most important thing that I can talk about, or I have talked about in my research. So let's move on here. And I wanted to give you a quick history of the NCAA. The NCAA is over 100 years old, and it was founded by a consortium of schools who recognized that football was going to be a moneymaker for it. And oddly, these schools were like Princeton and Harvard and Yale, right? Schools that we don't think of as football powers anymore. But the reason why the NCAA was founded was because people were dying in large numbers while playing this game, and it wasn't a very good look. So the NCAA was founded famously at the behest of then President Theodore Roosevelt to try to create a rule system that was going to make the game a little safer, a little less macabre. So the NCAA college sports kind of chug along, and where I want to pick up the story is in 1939 when the NCAA starts its basketball tournament. The first tournament, the championship was held at Northwestern University. The University of Oregon was the champion. And for about the first 12 or so years, the NCAA was competing neck and neck with the NIT, which was founded a year before the NCAA tournament, for the best postseason tournament in basketball. Right now we think of the NIT as kind of an also-ran in that. And one of the key events in college sports was in the early 1950s, there was a point-shaving scandal that involved NYU and the University of Kentucky and City College of New York, which was one of the big powerhouses of college basketball at the time. And in essence, New York became a radioactive area for college basketball. It was 65 years before New York City got to host another NCAA tournament game. And so at that moment, the NCAA tournament starts to take on greater importance than any other postseason tournament. And then three things happen right about the time of that point-shaving scandal that the NCAA starts to become, in essence, the central planner of college sports. First off, member schools were worried about the arms race of getting athletes to their campuses, right? If you're going to win these games, you have to have the best athletes. And at the time, what the schools were doing was, in essence, paying under the table, but everyone kind of winked about it. And they were worried that the athletes the programs are going to not be profitable. And so what they did was they asked the NCAA to be the regulator of the cartel, right? And once you start to have, in essence, competing firms fixing prices, that's when the cartel of the NCAA was born. So there's one thing, right? And it's got extreme power to regulate schools' behavior in the way that it wants to. The second thing is that schools were worried about losing attendance at football games because of the rise of television. And so what the schools did was give the NCAA the right to negotiate football broadcasts, right? I mean, this was immense power for the NCAA. And the third thing that happened was that a guy named Walter Byers, and if you go to my title slide, Walter Byers is one of the characters that's in that basketball. He took over the NCAA, an executive director position, when he was 26 years old and held that position for about 30 years. And ruled the NCAA as long as he could with an iron fist. And did a lot of great things for college sports, and also, I think, long run did some damage to college sports that we're still trying to figure out. But Byers was central in becoming, in essence, becoming the central planner, the central organizer for college sports. So move ahead to the 1970s, right? In between 1960 and 1980, the basketball tournament starts to become wildly popular, and that's because basketball started to enter into the modern age. African American players were playing at a higher rate. The game started to become more up-tempo relative to what was in essence was a sport that looked like hockey early in the dawn of basketball, and college or access to college was greater because of things like the GI Bill. So people had an emotional attachment to the schools that they were rooting for, and so what we see is basketball starting to become really popular, and I've got a couple of characters in that title slide. Coach John Wooden, who won 10 national championships for UCLA between 1964 and 1975, and one of the great early players of college basketball, Jerry Lucas, who was the star for Ohio State's two-time national champion team in 1960 and 1961. But you had, David Thompson from North Carolina State, Bill Walton from UCLA, Lou Alcindor from UCLA, right? And then in 1979, you have Magic Johnson from Michigan State playing Larry Bird for the national championship, and still the highest rated college basketball broadcast of all time. So popular, in fact, that they made a Broadway musical about it a couple of years ago. But this is the beginning of the NCAA having two forms of power, right? Of economic power. There's football, and then there's the college basketball tournament. NCAA's power to regulate television broadcasts ends, though, because a set of schools headlined by the University of Oklahoma sues the NCAA all the way to the Supreme Court for the right to have their own television broadcasts. And really, this is the dawn of the modern age of college sport here. The NCAA loses that case at the Supreme Court, and now you have conferences and schools have much more autonomy about the way that they're going to put the product out for football, right? Where now you have the college football playoff, and what's really important to understand about the position the NCAA is the NCAA gets no money from the college football playoff. That goes from the idea of the college football playoff to the conferences who are part of that championship. And so the NCAA loses one of its tools to regulate, right? Economic power is going to be important in regulating this league. And so the NCAA loses one of those tools, but at the same time, the basketball tournament really starts to become wildly popular. Tremendous basketball taking place in the 1980s. The 1982, 1983, right? I was born in 1974, so this was just like magical to watch this. 1982 final, 1983 final, 1987 final, 1985 final, one of the great upsets in the history of the sport. The 1988 final featured, and he's on the title slide, our current coach, the most outstanding player of the tournament, Danny Manning, winning the national championship. Right? It was an era in which players stayed for 3 or 4 years, got really seasoned experience, played together, kind of a band of brothers type situation, and the basketball was really good. It was wildly different than it is today, and that's something that I want to talk about later on. But now we get to the modern NCAA, and the NCAA right now is under a television contract with a couple of different broadcasters that pays them about $750 million for the rights to televise the NCAA tournament. And that's actually extended into, I think, 2031. It's gone up to $1.1 billion after the current contract ends. So I won't keep this slide up here long because it's a profit-loss statement, and who wants to look at that at 4 o'clock at the end of a workday? But I have this up here because that number right there, $794 million and change, is pretty close to $750 million, right? almost everything in that statement right there, and you can see that is like 80% of all of the NCAA's revenues. Almost everything in that number right there comes from the television, the rights to television broadcast. So this is the NCAA's golden goose. If anything happens to this golden goose, the NCAA will have to reimagine itself very, very quickly. And that's the most important thing that you can come away with today, is that the lack of ability for the NCAA to diversify, right? And that Supreme Court loss in 1984 looms large. The lack of the NCAA to diversify has left it in what I consider to be some perilous waters. So right away, we have to recognize 80% of all the NCAA's operating revenue, at least 80%, comes from the sale and the ticket sales of its basketball tournament. So let's move on from there quickly, and because we don't want to look at profit loss statements too long, and instead we'll look at two exciting journal articles from economics magazines published long ago. These are important to people who study sports economics because this is the foundation of our ideas about league governance. First off, we have Simon Rothenberg's article, The Baseball Players' Labor Market. This was published in 1956. And then over here we have The Peculiar Economics of Professional Sports, published by Walter Neal in 1964. Just to give you an idea about the time in which these articles were published, which I think makes them even more remarkable, this was published right at the dawn of the television era and still 2 decades out of free agency becoming fairly ubiquitous in professional sports. And yet he's able to talk about what might happen and what could happen if that idea comes to fruition, if a more free market stance comes to baseball. And over here, we have an article that's published right in the midst of the Celtics dynasty, right in the midst of the Yankees dynasty, right in the midst of the time where the AFL was challenging the NFL for football supremacy. And so I love to think about the way that these men were thinking about what they wanted to write about as it pertains to that time whenever I read these articles. So let's talk about why these articles are important and how we can use them to think about where the NCAA is at in this moment. So first, Rothenberg makes 3 really important points about the way that professional sports, or a sports league really, is organized. First, there has to be some measure of uncertainty, right? And I love the analogy that going to a game is like going to a theater, but no one knows what the script is, right? No one knows what the ending's going to be. Drama has already been played out. Everyone knows what their lines are. Sports are different because we show up to the game and no one really knows what's going to happen. So we have to have some sort of drama, and that means the teams have to be matched fairly evenly. And the second thing, if a league, if a sport is going to be, or a league is going to be considered a sports major league, it has to employ the best players. And that means they got to pay for them in one way, shape, or form. That means they're going to have to get in their pocketbooks and pay for those players. And then the last thing is that the set of rules that are adopted to run the game matter, because if the rules allow for complex strategies to occur, then more than one way can be adopted to win games. Neal's argument is also profound, I think. He looks at a sports league and he sees not a collection of firms that are battling against each other. He doesn't see GM and Ford and Chrysler. Instead, he sees one firm, and he describes it as a firm with plants located all over the place. And in order for that league to be successful, all of those plants have to be operating as well as they can be, so that there can be good contests between those teams that are comprising the league. And he also writes something really important here. There tends to only be one major league, right? Economic theory suggests that's going to be the case. And also, he goes through some anecdotes at the time that suggest that's going to be the case too. So let's talk about two things that I've written about as it pertains to these two articles in the NCAA. So first off, we want to think about how we can manufacture uncertainty. And the next thing we have to do is talk about the compensation ceiling that the NCAA uses in regulating its basketball league. Professional leagues use generally three different strategies to try to close down the resource differences that exist between the teams that comprise a league. They do revenue sharing, so they pool TV broadcast money or gate receipts. They use salary caps, and again, if you're in a professional league, the union has to okay the size of the salary cap, right? This is something that the college players don't have the right to weigh in on. And they also have drafts to get new inputs into the league, new labor inputs into the league. And this is a way to shore up the differences between the New York Yankees and the Pittsburgh Pirates, between the LA Dodgers and the Kansas City Royals, right? Massive, massive resource differences where the Yankees could, in essence, buy wins, where the Kansas City Royals have to use these tools to their advantage in order to be successful. So I look at these strategies that professional leagues use, and I see them in the way that the NCAA makes decisions about governance. It uses a salary cap, right? In men's basketball, I think you can have 13 scholarships, and a player can only get a scholarship and some cost of attendance stipend. If they get anything else, they're breaking the rules. So to me, that's a salary cap. They also use revenue sharing, and the NCAA pools part of the tournament revenues. They just send about 40% of the revenues back out to the member schools, of which there are about 1,000 at 3 different levels of competition: Division I, Division II, Division III. Within Division I, there's about 330 basketball teams. But the part of this that I question is the use of what's called the basketball fund. Right? And the NCAA is a cartel. Cartels tend to have hierarchies within them. And that's true for OPEC, that's true for any sort of cartel that you could imagine. And the NCAA, I don't think, is any different. And this is a piece of evidence that I think supports my observation of that idea really well. Right, the basketball fund in any one year is about 20% of that TV revenue deal that I talked about. So a couple years ago, it was about $200 million. And the basketball fund cuts checks to the conferences of the teams based upon their performance in the NCAA tournament. Now, I see this as a way for the rich to get richer, but also more importantly, for these smaller conferences who desperately need capital to build nicer facilities, to make better travel arrangements, right, to keep up with the richer schools. I see this as a way to keep capital out of their hands, right? Because if the dollar that goes to an ACC team is not the same as a dollar that goes to a MEAC team, right? On the margin, the level of productivity for any dollar that flows to a smaller conference team is going to be much bigger than it is for the resource-rich teams. So if you wanted to, I have this all online. If you want to read about that further, you can see that in the Washington Post article that was done a few years ago. But just to give you an idea about how much these checks are, if a team gets to the Final Four over about a 6-year period, they make about $8 million from the basketball fund. Or actually, the conference does, and how the conference splits up that money is really at the behest of the conference. But anyway, the ACC, whenever North Carolina or Duke, hopefully us soon, get to a Final Four, is about $8 million over a 6-year time period. Now, to give you an idea about how drop in the bucket this is for some teams, Notre Dame has an apparel deal with Under Armour that's worth $100 million over the next 10 years. They're in the midst of that deal. So I see the basketball fund for the rich conferences as almost being fun money. Right? This is almost just the $20 that grandma gives you for your birthday. This is just I'm going to go out and buy a few things with it. Whereas for smaller teams, this would be really, really important capital, but it keeps the hierarchy in check, right? It keeps the Big Ten and the ACC and the Pac-12 above some of the rival leagues within Division I. And we can see resource differences right here. The mighty Duke basketball team in 2015, by some estimates, took in $27 million in revenue. And then on the bottom end of this, you have Chicago State, which is one of the smaller teams in Division I, raised about $142,000 in revenue in a particular year. Right? So we're talking about massive resource differences across Division I members. And the NCAA basketball is kind of interesting economics because, in general, an economist would say, okay, there's labor and capital that's needed to produce things, and the labor in NCAA basketball is really under check, right? You can't, there's no free market for labor here. The free market comes in capital. And so if you're going to compete for players who will win you basketball games, you have to have capital so that you can build sterling facilities and have all sorts of accoutrements that the players expect from other teams. Right? And we can take a quick look at some of these accoutrements that players are coming to expect. This is the lazy river at the student athlete facility, and this hasn't been built yet, at the University of Central Florida. Right, after practice, I guess you take an inner tube and float along. Right, but this is an accoutrement that the University of Central Florida can show recruits and say, look, come here, win some games for us, and you get to play sand volleyball and float along the lazy river. Evidently, Clemson has a barber shop and a putt-putt course at its student athlete facility too. Right, I mean, this is capital. It could be used to pay players, but instead it's used to buy accoutrements for players so they're indirectly compensated. Next, we have the University of Kentucky basketball coach John Calipari showing off the apartments that only the University of Kentucky basketball players, plus one student who wins a lottery, because it's against NCAA rules to house athletes away from the rest of the student population. So one student in the University of Kentucky gets to also live with the University of Kentucky basketball players. Right? This dormitory is located right next to the practice facility. So the players, right, in essence, are just going back and forth from their apartment to the practice facility. The University of Kansas evidently has one of these basketball-only dorms under construction too. And then Wake Forest does this too, right? I mean, if we're going to compete in Division I football, we have to have accoutrements, and we can maybe see the cranes that are moving around that Capitol right now, a couple minutes walk from here. We can't expect to get good players at Wake Forest unless we have this kind of facility, because they go to other places that might be interested in them, and they have those facilities, so we need that too. But again, capital in the NCAA can be spent in almost any direction. Labor, though, is very tightly controlled. And so that makes it a really interesting market to an economist. So first off, let's look at this paper that I published about 4 years ago with an old colleague of mine, Stephen Bronars, about the way that the basketball tournament's organized. And before I get into this, I wanted to talk a little bit about uncertainty, because that's what this paper looks at, is the way that uncertainty is altered by the NCAA. So here's a couple facts for uncertainty. So since 1985, when the tournament first expanded to 64 teams, now it's 68, but when 1985, since 1985, there have been 33 tournaments. And that means that for every type of game that comprises the first round, right? So there's first seeds and 16th seeds, second seeds play 15 seeds, third seeds play 14 seeds. We've all filled out that bracket, right? There's 4 types of those games every year. that means that there's 33 years times 4 types of each game. That's 152 first versus 16 seeds. I'm sorry, 132 first versus 16 seeds. 132 games involving second versus 15 seeds, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about uncertainty. A 16 seed has never beaten a 1 seed. 132-0. That's not a lot of uncertainty. Let's talk about the second versus 15 games. Second versus 15 games, 124-8. All right, so that's about 94% winning percentage for the higher seed. Then you go down to the third and fourth games. So at this point, we're talking about half of all the first round games that comprise the most important event that the NCAA owns. Third seeds win 83%, fourth seeds win 81%. So all I need to know to know who won half of the games of the first round in the NCAA tournament was who is the higher seed. And I know that 90% of the time. That's not a lot of uncertainty. Right? I think we remember when Lehigh beats Duke, and so it maybe fools us about uncertainty. But if I just know who the higher seed was for those 1 through 4 games, 90% of the time I know who wins. To contrast that with baseball, which invited wild card teams. So the last team in the playoffs starting in 1995, so that's 23 World Series. 6 World Series champions have been wild card winners during that time. And it's much harder to upset a favorite if you have to play a series of games as opposed to a single elimination tournament, which the NCAA is. So here's another fact about the NCAA, right? And remember, in your minds, you want to be thinking, oh yeah, the basketball fund's cutting checks to these teams. Since 1980, there have been 38 tournaments. And that means there have been 38 times 4 Final Four entrants during that time, which comes to 152 Final Four entrants. I was counting up the other night. Since 1980, 11 Final Four entrants have come out of a conference that wasn't at the time considered to be one of the top 6 conferences in basketball, right? Just 11. 11 of the 152. So of the top 6 conferences, of which about every year you could argue there were 6 conferences that kind of stood out from the rest, that's about a fifth of all the college basketball teams. They have 141 of those 152 Final Four entrants. So a fifth of the Final Four entrants are going to, so 14/15 of the Final Four entrants are going to 1/5 of the teams, right? And 4/5 of the teams have 1/15 of the Final Four entrants. So, you can say, well, that's uncertain or certain or not. We can have that argument. I don't find that to be very uncertain. I think that it's clear indicator that there's a hierarchy within the cartel that's being serviced. So with that discussion here, let's dive into what we were trying to do in this paper. If we look at a typical bracket, we contrast 2 brackets, one from the 1987 tournament, one from the 2017 tournament. In the 1987 tournament, it was mandated that of the 8 teams that played in a particular arena, a particular game site, to start the tournament, all of those teams had to come from the same region. So, for instance, this is the West region of the 1987 tournament, and all 8 of these teams had to be from the West region. And this is interesting to an economist because this is a type of constraint, right? This rule constrained the NCAA in making its process, in making its tournament field. And to an economist, constraints are interesting because they cause scarcity. And really, economics is just the study of the way we get around scarcity. And here we can contrast that with the bracket from the 2017 game, because in 2002, the NCAA lifted that constraint and used what's called the pod system. And the pod system allowed for 4 teams from one region to play at a site, and then 4 teams from another region to play at a site. That's why in, I think it was 2012, I got to watch Duke play over in Greensboro. And I also got to watch North Carolina play over in Greensboro, despite the fact those teams were in a different region for that particular tournament. That was also a fun day because Duke lost to Lehigh in a 2:15 game. That was wild fun to watch that. The NCAA basketball tournament has become anyone but Duke for me. So here we have this story of a constraint lifted, right? And it was voluntarily lifted by the NCAA selection committee who figures out who's going to be in the tournament field. So we asked ourselves, right? We have this tournament that looked the same from 1985 to 2001. Let's estimate how many points it was worth for a team to have certain characteristics, right? So what was its quality, right? How many points would you expect it to score? What about the opponent? What was the quality difference between a team and its opponent? And then where was the game located? Did it matter if it had to travel a long distance or not? Did it matter if a game was in state or not? And it turned out that we found that an in-state game to a higher seed was worth about 3 points. Right? So in essence, what the NCAA allowed for that to happen was, it's 3-0 on the scoreboard when Duke plays in Greensboro. So then we asked ourselves, having figured out the statistic, who got these in-state games, these valuable in-state games? Who got some help from the committee? And what we see here is that in the pre-pod era, the committee really liked to have lower seed teams play in state. Right? These are the 9 through 16 teams. These guys were getting 13, 22% of opportunities to play in state, 29% of opportunities. Right? If the NCAA could get these guys to play in state, they did. They often did. Once the pod system was implemented, fat chance a lot of these teams were playing in state. And to make the contrast even different, what we saw was that the NCAA was giving 2, 3, and 4 seeds, which tend to be from the more powerful conferences, those valuable in-state assignments. So what we can conclude from this is that the NCAA, I think, had a hunch of what it was doing when it lifted that constraint. It was going to reduce uncertainty, but it also made it easier for fans to go to games. And every metric of attendance that we find was larger during the pod era than not. And I think there's like a double whammy here effect, because when the arena's full and I watch that on television, I think to myself, that must be an exciting game. There's a lot of people there, right? And television is really, really important to the NCAA. So these first-round games that are in these cavernous arenas where only 5,000 people show up, the NCAA wanted to eliminate that, where we turn that game on and we say, oh, I don't care about that because no one in the arena seems to care about that. I think the pod system was a way for the NCAA to take care of that problem. But now let's talk about amateurism, because this is really the elephant in the room, right? This is the situation that we keep hearing about over and over again when it comes to college sports. Real quickly, the way that I view the compensation choice in professional sports is owners would really like in the short run for compensation to athletes to be low, right? Because that would make profits be bigger, assuming you can hold revenue constant. If they have to pay them large amounts, then profits in the short run tend to be smaller. But when we think about what might happen with unintended consequences here, and we don't have to think very hard because history is a guide for us here, when athletes tend to be paid less, they tend to be enchanted by the possibility of point shaving, right, which baseball had to deal with in 1919, which college sports had to deal with in 1950, in the 1970s with Boston College, and more recently with Arizona State. So these are, if you're trying to cheat someone, a gambler might get to them, right? And if you don't bond them high enough, that increases the probability of this happening. But the other problems that occur is that it allows for upstart leagues to possibly start bidding away. It makes it easier for them to bid away the talent that makes this league the major league. And we don't have to look far again in history to see that. And this, I think, is the issue that the NCAA really needs to be careful with, because it is placing a hard cap on compensation, and it will be a lot easier because of that reason for an interested party to possibly bid away the talent that makes up Division I basketball. And in fact, if we just look back through history, every league went through this situation, right? The National League was the incumbent league in 1901, and by 1903 it had been beaten by the American League. It was a tsunami of bidding that the American League did that essentially made the National League say, okay, we can't beat you, let's join you. And then they started to cap compensation together. Right? And the World Series was first played in 1903. That's why that happened. The NFL and the AFL in the 50s and 60s, the AAFL and the AFL in the 50s and 60s start to encroach on the NFL's monopoly in professional football, which is why we're playing the Super Bowl this weekend with the AFC and the NFC champion. And the NBA and the ABA and the NHL and the WHL in hockey, right? Every single situation was the same. There was a rival league that recognized it could bid away the talent from the major league, and it did it, right? And instead of there being two leagues, like Neal said, now there's just one, right? And they're working together to try to hold down compensation again until free agency was allowed. So this is the problem the NCAA, I argue, faces here in this moment. And recognize I'm not going into economic or legal or moral or legal arguments here. I'm just talking about simple history of what we've observed with leagues that have some sort of monopoly status within a sport. But I would argue that this has already happened. And to understand the choice that this man made in 2003 to not play in college, to go from St. Vincent St. Mary's High School in Akron, Ohio, straight to the Cleveland Cavaliers, you have to understand what happened with salaries to basketball players starting in 1990, right? The television deal in 1990 increased the revenue pool, which gets split by owners and players by about 300%. There was a man named Michael Jordan who was playing at the time, and the demand for basketball just escalated quickly, right? And then you couple that with cable television. And so right around 1990, the opportunity cost of being in college started to rise, right? Because every year I'm in college, I'm not earning that big salary, that increasing salary that might await me in the NCAA or in the NBA. So just to give you a contrast of the reality that took place after that television contract, in 1992, every single first-round draft pick in the NBA draft played at least 3 years in college. That included Shaquille O'Neal, Christian Laettner, among others. By 2001, only 10 of the first draft picks in the NBA draft had 3 years or more experience in college, right? I mean, it made it an emergency if you thought that you could be an NBA player to get into the NBA. And that's why you started to see in 1995 Kevin Garnett say, I'm just not even going to play in college. Kobe Bryant followed him in 96, Tracy McGrady in 97, and eventually the great LeBron James in 2003 said, I'm just not even going to go to college anymore. And these are kind of things that you start to get used to them, but I find it extraordinary that college basketball didn't shrug its shoulders and say, we kind of need these guys in our league, right? It would be really nice to have someone with the generational talent of LeBron James play for a couple of years. Now, we might have to compromise on our rules, but it would be really great for the sport for that to happen. Now, over here is a guy named Terrence Ferguson, who's a rookie with Oklahoma City in the NBA. Ferguson was a McDonald's All-American in the class of 2016 and was slated to go to the University of Arizona. And a professional team from Australia said, hey, why don't you come over to Melbourne and play for us, we'll pay you actual money because we know you're only going to go to the University of Arizona for a year. And Ferguson said, I'll take that deal. So instead of this highly talented player going over to the University of Arizona and playing for a year or two, he left for a place that was going to pay him directly. Right? And here, I don't know if I trust this guy. I can't believe he's in my slideshow. But this is the father of 3 really talented basketball players, one of whom is on the title slide. He only played for a year at UCLA. He's claimed that he's going to start a rival league to college basketball. But this group right here, I would be worried about if I were the NCAA, because what they're going to do is start paying the best about 40 basketball players in the high school basketball players in the United States to come play for the club teams at historically black colleges. And one of the founders of this I'm an acquaintance with, he was the chief economist for the O'Bannon trial, which took place over the last 5 years, where Ed O'Bannon was the named plaintiff in a class action suit against the NCAA. So I mean, this is right on the cusp. This is something that if I worked at the NCAA or in college athletics, I'd really worry about, because if the top 100 players go to another league, then all of a sudden we're being asked to watch college basketball that looks a little bit watered down, right? The players are a little slower, they're a little shorter, the jump shots don't go in quite as much, and that's not as interesting to us. It takes talent to run a major league. And so I see this situation over the last 20 years develop, but then I see this, and I would be really worried if I were in college sports about this, especially college basketball. Right? And I'm not the only one who noticed this. At the beginning of the 2016-17 season, there was a great article in the New York Times Magazine on just the lack of quality in college basketball. Right? The best players play for a year or two, and then they go to the NBA, whereas 20 years ago, 30 years ago, guys were staying for 3 or 4 years. The best players would be juniors or seniors playing at a very high level in those games. So this brings us kind of to the end of my presentation here. Right, we're seeing serious questions as to whether or not the NCAA governance model is even consistent with the U.S. Constitution. There's been some serious legal interpretation of that with the O'Bannon trial and the Jenks trial, which is an antitrust case. We also saw the Northwestern football team try to unionize. The reason why I have Pat Summitt on that title slide is because a lot of this revenue that goes towards women's sports comes from football and men's basketball. And if men's basketball becomes less valuable, it'll be more difficult to provide meaningful opportunities for women players as well. And then finally, you know, I'm a professor. I tend to be a little bit idealistic about my profession, and I wonder about whether or not we're really living up to our ideals in terms of offering good education to some of these young people, right? And this here is a rendering of the Louisville athletic department right now. Right there, you thought it was Star Wars, but that's actually the Louisville athletic department. Right? If you want questionable land deals, we have those. If you want a coach that was extorted by someone who had an affair with him on a table at his restaurant, my mom's watching this, by the way. We've got that for you, right? And those are just problems that accompany successful high flyers in college sports, right? But the FBI was clearly sniffing around in what Louisville was doing in terms of paying players off book. And then just to add to that, they were using prostitutes during recruiting trips for highly valued recruits. Right? If I were part of the University of Louisville, I would not like any of this, and that's why. But we've seen this story over and over and over again in college sports, and I think it's partially because of the lack of transparency about how we're compensating some of these really, really talented young men. So I'll just give you really quickly What I think could happen here is that you drive down Walter Neal Avenue and you try to shore up much of the Division I basketball, so you cut down uncertainty. I don't think that the hierarchy within the cartel would like that very much. Or you could use status quo lane and do things that could perhaps ease some of these tensions that we're seeing. To me, the real easy things to do would be that colleges need to recognize what we've got here is really hard to replicate, right? We can't just start a league and have the cultural touchstone that is college sports to a lot of people. We might as well leverage that, and let's compromise a little bit on the way that we pay these players. You got to have a players' union be recognized. They need to have a say in what's going on. And I think a really, really interesting thing to do would just allow the players to have access to their own image, right? If a player has a shoe deal, let them profit off of it. I think that would probably exacerbate some of the problems of uncertainty, but it would allow for the NCAA to at least give some compensation to these people who clearly are worth more than whatever the value of the scholarship is. So I've run over a little bit, but I think we wanted to have time for a few questions, so I'm very happy to answer some of those questions. Stephen.
I have a two-part question. So you talked a little bit about, I'll use the word loophole, Kentucky having one student in the lottery system who's able to get the same benefit. It's going to allow them to give it to a specific subset. Somewhat similar ruling in the North Carolina situation where they said student athletes didn't receive a benefit that other students didn't receive as well. It was more an academic issue. And so my question, kind of building off of that, particularly using basketball as the example where there's a partnership with the NBA and the NCAA, and that students have to go somewhere for a year. Most choose to go to the NCAA because it's in America and it's what they're used to. What's the tension towards the benefits they might receive in 4 to 5 months that other students have access to as well that allow that loophole, which is good for both products? NBA being a developmental league that they can watch and recruit from, and NCAA getting the best talent.
So if I were McDonald's high school All-American, I would want to go to a university that that plays on a national stage, so that my name brand recognition can be bigger. So that's something that would be really attractive to me. Right, the student population could benefit from that because they get to see really good players. So I'd want to go to Duke. I'd want to go to North Carolina. I'd want to go to UCLA or Kentucky because I can play on national television multiple times, and my name is more highly recognized. So when it comes time to sign a shoe deal, when it comes time to go to the NBA draft, people know me better. Did I answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
More or less just thinking about in a post-LeBron world, they now have to, at one point you could go directly into the NBA. So the partnership now with the NCAA and the NBA that they have to go somewhere for a year after high school, whether it's the NCAA or it's Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the back end of it's both good for those institutions, but not necessarily good for the benefit of these athletes being able to make money right away. In essence, it's not a free market.
College sports is a lot friendlier than going to a professional league. And if you think about what the minor league for basketball would look like to someone who wouldn't be able to go directly into the professional leagues, it exists over there in Greensboro. It exists in my hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it is a far cry from playing in Madison Square Garden. And if you're playing at Duke, if you're playing in North Carolina or Kentucky, you get to play in front of 23,000, 8,000, 10,000 adoring fans on national television rather than taking a bus and eating fast food out of a bag to get to the next game. But if I were an NBA scout, I would want to have information about those kids. And I think I find it hard to believe that the NBA hasn't allowed for more kids to get into the developmental league at an earlier age. It'd just be a lot easier to gain information about their character, their skill set, their ability to learn. And, you know, we see over and over again kids get drafted and they don't work out because they just didn't know. The teams didn't know about who that kid was. John?
How much does this system depend on law? This is salary cap. I mean, if they did that to us, somebody would be in jail.
It depends very much on law, and law has been on the NCAA side over and over again, and that's why, I mean, I don't want to say I'm the first to come out with this, but I feel like no one else is really talking about the fact that the NCAA could just be raided, right, where the talent pool would just dry up almost in a year or two when kids were offered enough to not go to school, but instead, you know, toil away in the minor leagues for a little while to prove their worth. But the law right now has basically sided with the NCAA's reasoning is that this needs to be the way it is for competitive balance, right? And you can hear Simon Rothenburg in the courtroom. The famous trial in this was the O'Bannon trial, and it was great because the judge who was there had no idea about college sports. So in essence, she was a really intelligent Martian dropped in and explained the system. And when you go over the transcripts of the trials, her questions have a level of incredulity that she can't believe this is happening, right? Why are they doing this? Why would you agree to this? But so far, you know, the court system has sided with the NCAA on this. You're exactly right. One legal decision makes the whole thing turn over, but I think the market could also speak more loudly than a legal decision. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
I was curious on your opinion of like the structure of a possible players union with high member turnover. Would it be mandatory? Could conferences or individual schools maintain them without perpetuating the financial inequality, or would it be like an umbrella NCAA players union?
You got me. I don't know. My kind of vision of this is that I see about 70 schools saying we don't really need the NCAA anymore, right? We have college football money, and we'll just do without the traditional first-round David and Goliath matchup, and we'll just operate on our own. That to me is kind of the direction I see this heading, rightly or wrongly. But the NCAA is kind of a pesky nuisance to a lot of these schools anymore. So whether or not those schools want to include the Chicago States and the UNC Greensboros, I'm not sure. This could go in a lot of different directions. But it needs to go in a different direction if the NCAA wants to survive. That's what I want you to walk out with here, in my opinion. Well, thank you. I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.